Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and Voxiversity. Now, if you're not familiar with Voxiversity, I'd encourage you to check it out. You can go to voxiversity.com. You can also find the Voxiversity channel on YouTube or on BitChute. It's not the same as the Darkstream channel. So if you're subscribed to the Darkstream channel, to the Voxday channel, it's different than the Voxiversity. And the reason that you might want to check it out is because these Darkstreams are just me talking extemporaneously about whatever subject I happen to be onto at the moment. Recently it's been Jordanetics, but you know, I'll be moving on to other things soon, I'm sure. Voxiversity is me going into more detail, working with a professional producer, so we kind of hit the dialectic and the rhetoric at the same time, using graphics and video and music and so forth. So it's a more professional. It's a more professional production. So what I wanted to talk about tonight is in response to an email that I received today. And it was either an email or a comment on the blog. I'm not actually sure which now that I think about it. But it was a young guy, and he said, you know, hey, I was completely taken in by Jordan Peterson. You know, he did not have the wherewithal to see through what the guy was doing. He said, you know, when you point this stuff out to me, when you point these problems out to me, I can see that I was fooled, but I still don't know why. You know, what was it that I was missing? And at the same time, a lot of people have said to me, well, how is it possible for you to have been calling this guy out as a fraud before you read the books and before you watched any of the videos and that sort of thing? And the answer is pretty simple. You know, some people theorize, well, you know, maybe you reached that opinion and then you're trying to justify that opinion and so forth. But that's not true. It's not true at all. And the reason is very straightforward. It's simple pattern recognition. Okay? Think about it. If you are a guy who goes to nightclubs a lot, you're probably going to be much better at picking out a woman who is going to be amenable to your approaches, more amenable to your approaches than the average guy. You know, the average guy is just going to see a bunch of girls in high heels and cocktail dresses, but the guy who is accustomed to that scene, he is going to know, you know, which is going to be the individual most susceptible. Okay? In much the same way, when I am reading something that somebody has written, you know, I'm an author, I'm an editor, and I'm also a very avid and active reader. And so, for me, it's fairly easy to very quickly see whether somebody knows what they're talking about, doesn't know what they're talking about, or doesn't know what they're talking about and is attempting to make it look like they do. You know, is attempting to hide the fact that they don't know what they're talking about. And there are 7 signs that I've put together that you can use that will give you a reliable heuristic, a useful tool for discerning whether someone is a charlatan or not. Now, the first one And the most obvious one, and this one is absolutely 100% reliable. And that is how they treat the definition of commonly used words. I'll give you one obvious example. When you're talking to an atheist, some of them, it's mostly the less intelligent ones who are just repeating what they've been told. But sometimes the intelligent ones do this, and when they do so, they're doing so because they are intellectual frauds. And what they do is they redefine the term evidence so that it means scientific evidence. So, for example, when they're talking about the existence of God or the existence of the supernatural, they will say, well, there's no evidence for any of these things. But that's not true. There is considerable testimonial evidence. There's considerable documentary evidence. And they know this. We know that they know this because Richard Dawkins goes to some trouble in a couple of his books attacking the notion of eyewitness testimony. He cites the gorilla basketball drill in order to demonstrate that eyewitness testimony is less than perfectly reliable. Now, this is a legitimate point. Of course, he then relies on false information when he talks about the reliability of scientific evidence. In fact, scientific evidence is so unreliable that it is not even permitted in a court of law automatically. It has to be granted relevance and so forth by the judge, whereas there are other forms of evidence that are considered to be more reliable. And in fact, this is not an outdated artifact of pre-scientific days. This is actually a highly justifiable approach to the fact that science is very, very unreliable. Less than 50% of all published scientific studies can be successfully replicated. And so, the fact that the scientific evidence doesn't exist, which may or may not be true, is irrelevant when there is actual evidence of these various things. This is something that one of my co-writers and I, we got into a debate. Dante and I actually published a debate called On the Existence of Gods, and we get into that question there. But the point is that whenever you're dealing with a charlatan, they will change the evidence. They will change the definition of the word. No, we're not going to get into, some people are popping up with questions and stuff. We're not going to get into that now. That's not the point. I'm just giving you an example. Okay? You cannot say there is no evidence of X when there is evidence of X. You can say, for example, there is no scientific evidence of X, but they don't want to say that because that's not a convincing enough statement. And so they change the definition of evidence to scientific evidence in order to try to make their point on a false basis. So that's the first sign. Anytime you see someone changing a definition, in the case of Jordan Peterson, of course, what does he change? He changes the definition of truth. He changes the definition of being. He implies that he's using Heidegger's, but it's not correct. So that's an excellent sign. Anytime you see someone changing the definition of a well-defined, commonly understood term, it's a reliable sign that they're full of it. The sign number 2, they prefer speaking to writing. I realize this is a little ironic because here I am, in a spoken medium. But the genuine intellectual always prefers writing. Number one, writing forces you to articulate more precisely. There are many things that sound pretty good, but once you put them down on paper, you realize that the argument has holes in it. You start to see the problems with it. It is much easier to baffle and dazzle and bypass people's reason when you're speaking to them. Speech is more intrinsically rhetorical than writing. And so anytime you see someone who is really big on speaking and who is much prefers lecturing to writing, that's a clue. It's not as reliable as the first sign, but it is definitely an indicator. Sign number 3. They reliably provide evasive answers to direct questions. Now, there are times when you have to avoid a direct question. When someone poses you the equivalent of a "have you stopped beating your wife" type of question, it's totally legitimate to refuse to answer it. Okay, let's get rid of this guy. We're not talking about Trump. Just go away. So whenever you are dealing with somebody who is asked a relevant direct question, when you're dealing with someone who is asked a pertinent question that is substantive and is not a gotcha question, when it's aimed at understanding or clarifying something the person has said or what the person's position is, and they respond evasively. If they respond to a question that is meant to clarify their position, and their response is to try to fog it up even more, this is also a very reliable sign that you're dealing with a charlatan. We see this again, using Peterson as the example. We see this when he's asked about being a Christian. We see this when he's asked about his politics. Everything turns into this evasive, nebulous fog of words which are designed to obscure rather than clarify. The fourth sign you really see a lot of when you're reading Peterson's books. He's far from the only one who does this, but again, it's the charlatans and the intellectual frauds who do it. And what they do, actually Sam Harris does this quite a lot too. What they do is they pose a question. Couldn't it be said? Couldn't we say? And the example I'll give is from Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. He says, couldn't it be said that well-being is synonymous with the good? I'm paraphrasing here. It's not a quote. This is from memory, so excuse me if I don't nail it precisely. But he says, couldn't we substitute well-being for good? And there we've got the changing definition, which is suspicious. But then he builds on that, because what they do, the charlatan then treats the implied answer as an assumption, or worse, he treats it as if it is a proven fact. So he asks the question, he provides the answer, and then he treats it as if it has been settled. This is very intellectually shady. You see it a lot as the basis for false arguments. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with making an assumption and then building an argument off that assumption and making it very clear that if you accept that assumption, then the argument holds. That is what intellectually legitimate people do. But when you're trying to hide the fact that the foundational basis for your argument is an assumption, you're trying to act like you've proven it when you quite clearly haven't, then you know you're dealing with a fraud. The fifth sign of an intellectual charlatan is that they reliably use secondary and tertiary sources instead of primary sources. It was really strange when I was reading Peterson's Maps of Meaning. The only reference to Aristotle in the entire book is 2 mentions of Aristotle in a quote from a theologian. How on earth do you why would you be talking about Aristotle through some minor theologian? Why would you be addressing medieval rhetoric through somebody who was writing about it in 1967? Why don't you look at what some of the medieval characters were writing about rhetoric at the time? What the intellectual fraud is doing is he's trying to hide the fact that he doesn't actually know anything about it. So he digs up a quote, he digs up a paper, he digs up a study that supports the position that he wants to make, and then he operates on the basis of the assumption that the person is, number one, telling the truth, and number two, that he's understood it. In many cases, you see that these frauds who are always relying on secondary and tertiary sources, they don't even appropriately apply the sources that they're using. The references that Peterson makes to Nietzsche and the implied references to Heidegger are often incorrect. Now, I'm no expert whatsoever on Heidegger, so I can't, I might be guilty of the same thing, of doing that myself right now. I don't know enough about Heidegger to say that the people who claim to know Heidegger are observing that Peterson is using it improperly. And I won't even go there with Jung, because I don't know enough about Jung to say whether that's being applied properly. But I do know enough, and I have read enough Nietzsche to know that Peterson is, on occasion, improperly applying various aspects of Nietzsche that he's relying upon. So, but the key thing is, whenever you see somebody who is habitually making use of secondary and tertiary sources rather than primary sources, they probably don't know what they're talking about. The sixth sign of the charlatan is the way that they substitute superficial knowledge about something in order to substitute for substantive knowledge of the subject. You see this a lot in college graduates. There's a tendency with a lot of people who have been to college and who have maybe taken a classics course or taken a philosophy course to think that because they have heard of something, they know it. Yeah, and when I was younger, I was guilty of that too. I felt that I knew the Euthyphro dilemma. I felt like I knew Euthyphro. And, I could tell you what the dilemma was because I had a course, a classics course at university, and we had talked about it and read a little bit about it and that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I was writing The Irrational Atheist and I had to delve into it because some atheists were bringing that up, so I needed to have a deeper understanding of it, that I realized that I didn't really have a substantive knowledge of Socrates' whole discussion with Euthyphro. And it was kind of interesting because when I read it, I realized that there is no Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates cheats when he constructs the dilemma. It's an artificial dilemma, and it's not even a legitimate argument. If you happen to read that section of The Irrational Atheist, you can see exactly where it is that Socrates makes that little definitional switch. So Socrates himself was capable of this kind of charlatanry. So the thing is that when you hear somebody say, "Oh, I've heard of that," you need to understand that that is essentially a confession that they don't know anything about it, or they know very, very little about it. And this is quite common. I mean, especially in the day of Wikipedia and Infogalactic and Google and all the stuff that you can look up. It's very easy for people to fake a level of knowledge that they don't truly have. You can suddenly be dropping all of this incredible detail, which is kind of funny when sometimes you catch people out. But what's even worse, I think, is when people are saying things and the facts they are quoting are inaccurate and demonstrate that the person's knowledge doesn't even rise to the level of Wikipedia. I mean, come on. If you can't even bother to look it up, there's a discussion yesterday on the blog, and people were, we were talking about the situation in Gaza and the situation with the Israelis, and somebody had said something, bringing up something from Twain about how the land of Palestine was completely empty, nobody lived there, and it was never called Palestine except for in the Roman days. I was like, what are you talking about? It was called the Mandate of Palestine. That was the British name for it. That's where the modern name comes from. They didn't go back to the Roman provinces and dig up names from then. I mean, maybe that's where the British took it from, but the point is that yes, there was a Palestine. It was the Mandate of Palestine. And instead of there being nobody living there, there were 266,000 Arabs living there. I mean, granted, fewer than there are now. But to claim that it was like this empty wasteland and nobody was living there and so forth is just absurd. And it doesn't detract from the massive accomplishment of the Israeli settlers who turned what was not a terribly productive place into a place that's, pretty close to a first world country in a lot of ways now. It doesn't take anything away from that achievement to point out the historical facts. But to not know these things, to have a level of knowledge that does not rise to the level of Wikipedia, that is a certain sign of a charlatan. And finally, the seventh sign of a charlatan is somebody who prefers to talk about their credentials, and they prefer to talk about the praise that they receive from others rather than address the criticism that they also receive. If you look at my blog, how many times do you see a post up that is, says something, oh, thank you, Vox, you helped me see X, Y, or Z. You're so wonderful. I'm so grateful. You're the neatest, greatest intellectual out there. How often do you see me posting stuff like that? How often do you see people who are serious intellectuals focusing on the praise that they receive instead of addressing the criticism they receive? I mean, for me, I'm much more comfortable dealing with criticism anyhow. Probably because I had a highly critical father, and so to a certain extent, I don't even know what to do with unvarnished praise. I find it kind of unsettling. I think I'm probably waiting for the other shoe to drop or something. But if somebody just gives you criticism, then you know where you are. Okay, did I get something wrong? Does this person just not know what they're talking about? That's easier, and also, frankly, it's more interesting. It's nice. It's nice when people like your stuff. It's nice that people appreciate what you're doing. That's all great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't express appreciation to those you're grateful for. I like to express my appreciation for the people who have positively influenced me. I mean, let's face it, I gush about Umberto Eco all the time, still. And I did to his face. And he wasn't terribly comfortable with it. But the thing is that if you look at, the Jordan Petersons, the Ben Shapiros, they love to talk about how other people tell them they're great. But if you're genuinely confident in what you're doing, that stuff doesn't really mean anything to you. You're glad people like it, but it's kind of like if you're an athlete, it's always a little bit strange when somebody will tell you, oh, you're really fast, or you can jump really high. The athlete's reaction to that tends to be, well, no shit, Sherlock, I just ran a 10.2. That's fast. And that's the reaction of somebody who has an objective standard to compare themselves by and genuine confidence in what they've achieved. I mean, awards are fine. Achievement is good. But at the end of the day, what have you done for me? What have you done for man? What have you done for yourself lately? I don't even read the stuff that I've written, my books. I had to reread A Throne of Bones recently because I'm finishing up A Sea of Skulls, and there were some things that I needed to refresh my memory in. And it's kind of funny because, it's been long enough since I wrote it that I was kind of reading it like a regular reader. There were things I'd completely forgotten about. I'm really glad I read it because I would have completely left certain threads unaddressed if I hadn't. But, if you're sitting around constantly staring at your navel and constantly looking for appreciation of what you've already done, all that's going to do is hamstring your ability to do better in the future. Somebody just asked me if I ever listened to Psychosonic. Almost never. Every now and then, my kids sometimes give me a hard time because if it comes up on there's a couple songs that are on my USB stick, and when they come up, I usually just flip past them. They always think that's really funny. But there's a time and a place to bask in your past achievements. But I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm not criticizing it. I'm simply saying that when you see somebody who prefers talking about other people's praise of them to dealing with other people's criticism of them, that is a sign. It's not proof, but it's a sign that you're dealing with a charlatan, that you're dealing with an intellectual fraud. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that this gives you some improved ability to spot these charlatans and these frauds and these intellectual con artists. Have a good evening. We'll see you on the blog.